Senator Elizabeth Warren, the person who claims that she has a plan for everything, just released her Medicare for All transition plan, and it's frankly bad, not good, very not good. So let me give you some details on this, right? So now, under this new proposal, Warren would establish during her first 100 days what she calls a Medicare for All option. Now, Medicare for All option, that's a public option. So in the first 100 days, she's going to set up a fight to establish a public option, kind of like what Pete Buttigieg and Biden. That's their plan, respectively. Okay, so open up Medicare for those who want it. That's literally, Buttigieg's plan, and that would be her first bill. Okay, and so I say first bill because what she has done is that she has split up this fight for Medicare for all, which would be under, for example, Bernie Sanders, would be one piece of legislation. And so she splits that up into two different pieces of legislation, two different fights. One at the beginning of her first term, the other, as she explains later, much later in her terms. So now, she says that while the initial stages of the transition she proposes would take place over the first half of her term, and that's assuming, of course, this gets pushed through, and she's able to make it through without, basically getting it shut down by not only Republicans, which are certainly going to be against it, but centrist Democrats will also probably be against a public option plan. Like what happened with the ACA, you ended up having centrist Democrats, blue dog Democrats, being against that. And I know you might thinking, wait a minute, no, the centrist plan is a public option. No, it's not. It's to continue the ACA with private health insurance money. And that's what that is. But okay, let's continue, right? Now, she did say that, and this is her timetable, right? So within the first 4 years, she said, no later than my third year in office, we will begin the fight to pass legislation that would complete the transition to full Medicare for all. So first 100 days, public option, and then she hopes that everything will come together and people will have enough experience with the public option to say, I would like to go to Medicare for all now, so let's go. Okay. So look, disastrous plan, in my opinion, because again, you have one fight to get it, to get that public option, which, look, anybody who remembers the ACA fight, right? How much political capital was spent just on that fight? How much, Republican talking points, of course, we're going to have those, and how much, of a fight and how confusing it was to have this set up in the first place. Anybody who's been through that fight knows that this is doomed to fail. Because, again, you have that one fight, which is already going to be a knockdown, drag-out fight for just that public option. And then you're planning another one 2 years later. I mean, what are you doing? I mean, there are huge issues with that approach. And again, a lot of it depends, unfortunately, on a series of circumstances that goes exactly as Elizabeth Warren plans. And I don't think that's how that works. Unfortunately, in a perfect world, it'd be great if everything worked out according to our plans. But again, she has to rely on a very specific set of circumstances to even set that up for the next Medicare for All expansion that she plans in her third year. And by the way, that is why she is... and that would be while she would be running for her second term, by the way, and campaigning, that she'd be doing this fight. So, oh boy. Okay. So now, one problem. The next is the timeline. Writer and activist Carl Beischer points out in one of his articles that he wrote in Jacobin that during the first legislative push, Republicans would argue that the Warren's first bill, it is a radical communist government takeover power grab doomed to dysfunction and failure. And single-payer activists would be backed into either abandoning the project or insisting that, yes, the public-private plan is actually quite reasonable and good, which, of course, none of those things are correct. I don't believe that the public option will be successful in the long term. In the short term, sure. It will actually help a lot of people, but in the long term, it is doomed to failure because the amount of lobbying in this country uh, that are going to, of course, use politicians, money in politics to undercut the system. Because, look, we have a lot of corruption in this country, and it's caused through money in politics. So you allow a government option, a private option with private insurance to compete with each other. Well, you're going to have lobbying from these private insurance companies that are going to try to cut services, and to cut funding, and to minimize what is actually covered so that most people will choose. And by the way, this is the other thing. These private insurance companies will make it so that they actually cover more, uh, and do it in a way that might, again, undercut this this public system to get people to go over to theirs. And what's left in the public system is basically the old, the sick, people who actually need that coverage, right? And so it creates this death spiral, essentially, in the public system, which then, of course, politicians will inevitably criticize as being too expensive, too bloated to work, and that only going back to a fully private system will actually save money in the long run. That's what this is, right? And so that's a big, big problem. But anyway, his point, Bayer's point, was there's no way that the fight for single payer would survive Warren's plan. Yeah. It is practically tailor-made to divide, depress, marginalize, and exhaust any political will for single payer even before we've begun the final fight. And I think he's absolutely right. Because, again, it's going to be the same issue that we saw with the ACA. And even trying to get a public option, because, again, I remember that fight. I remember saying, well, no, but we do want a public option with the ACA. But now we're forced to defend this thing, this amalgamation of private, public subsidies, private insurance, and all this complicated mess from the Republicans, who are relentlessly going to assault it. And by the way, the Obama administration says they will, Republicans will come around. They'll eventually support us. The fever will break. Did the fever ever break? No, of course not. And that's why one of the reasons, again, the centrist Democrats, is another reason why we didn't have a public option to begin with. And going through that fight just for a public option again? No, I'm not interested in that. That's disastrous. All right. So now, Will Menaker, one of the co-hosts of Chapo Trap House, also weighed in. He said, it's game over on the question of whether Elizabeth Warren supports Medicare for all. You start arguing about it now. She doesn't. Now, also critical of the proposal was New Republic staff writer Libby Watson. So now, her criticism of this boils down to the fact that this is essentially a plan to pass a public option before pivoting to single payer. And that plan is, and that strategy, I should say, is too clever for its own good. And it complicates something that should be fairly simple. Okay. According to Watson, Warren has made a mistake by allowing criticisms of bad faith Republicans and attacks on Medicare for all from within their own party from people like Nancy Pelosi, Joe Biden, and Pete Buttigieg, all people that get lots and lots of money from the health insurance industry, to constrain the public narrative about what is and what is not possible to achieve in the upcoming political battle over healthcare. Democrats, she says, are so often bent on being clever that they end up somewhere incredibly stupid. So, too clever, it's stupid. Makes sense. Because, again, there's these Democrats that are like, we're playing three-dimensional chess with Republicans so that we'll win. It's funny because we always seem to lose three-dimensional chess. That's because we're not playing it. No, you got to keep things simple. You got to keep things And unfortunately, this is the reality with our politics. You have to keep things simple, and there's actually no more of a simple policy than Medicare for all. What's complicated is this private public mess that we have in the ACA. And so we have Medicare, it works, it's one payer. That's why they call it single payer, that handles payments to doctors and hospitals. At, which, by the way, you no longer have to have copays at the point of service. So it's not only more simple for the government to be able to handle the payments than it does insurance companies, but it's also simpler for you because you have no out-of-pocket costs. You don't have to figure out who's in network, who's out of network, what your copay is going to be for the specific visit or the specific medication. You don't have to figure any of that out. It's actually far more simple. It's a simple option. But Elizabeth Warren seems to want to take a simple idea and complicate the hell out of it. And that doesn't make any sense for somebody who's supposedly the ideas person. And unfortunately, there are too many great intentioned people, Medicare for all proponents, that are saying, oh no, Warren's playing smart. I mean, Pramila Jayapal, I have a lot of respect for her. Adi Barkan, I have so much respect for him and his fight. They both said, oh, Warren's plan is great. No, I disagree with that. I do. I disagree with that. Because I think what they're doing is making something that should be simple incredibly complicated, and it's making it far more difficult for something like this to actually pass through Congress. And look, Watson has a lot more critiques on this. Basically, saying that again, this is too complicated. And that the Democrats are unfortunately making too many political calculations based on whether or not success is guaranteed. And we see this all the time. Democrats won't do anything until they absolutely 100% know that they're going to win on the issue. But how do you know if you're going to win unless you try? Right? And that's the problem here. She said what currently passes for policy fights among Democrats boils down to the struggle to discover the magic point where compromise and passage become guaranteed, rather than developing the best possible policy and staking a claim to be the party that will resolve America's problems. And so, look, that's you see Republicans do this all the time, by the way. They will stake their claim on a policy. Now, what's different, of course, is that the Republicans don't actually pick out the best policy for America. They pick out the best policies for their donors, and then they stake their claim on that. Or they take something absolutely ridiculous that their base wants, like, for example, a wall between us and Mexico, and they stake their reelection chances on that. And then they fight like hell for it. And it does lead to political wins. Now, we don't have a wall yet because, again, that was more of a distraction thing in order to get themselves elected. But the first thing they did, and this was a win for them, instead of the wall, they got massive tax cuts for the rich. More massive than the Bush tax cuts, bigger than anyone would have ever, expected them to get. Why? Because they actually do fight for it. And that's something that Democrats don't do unless victory is 100% guaranteed. It's disastrous, right? And so, look, if Democrats actually would stake their claim on this policy position, Medicare for all, even if it's not a winning issue. Because, by the way, remember back in 2016, Bernie Sanders ran on this, even when it was deeply, I wouldn't say deeply unpopular, but it was unpopular. And he brought this policy to the mainstream, and now you still have a majority of people, a slim majority of people, because, you have constant attacks from Pete Buttigieg and Joe Biden and corporate media on the issue. But you still have a small majority of Americans that favor Medicare for all. If you actually fight for it and stake your claim on it, you might actually win. You might actually be able to get good policy. And that's the thing. The problem is a lot of these Democrats don't want this policy, and it's because they're paid off by health insurance corporations. Now, Elizabeth Warren, she says she doesn't take corporate PAC money. but she will bundle money for Democratic politicians. So, like for me, it's just again, I can't help wonder why on earth Elizabeth Warren would take something like I said, this simple Medicare for all, doing away with private insurance, and come up with this incredibly complicated plan that hinges so much on things going exactly the way that she wants them to. It doesn't make sense. Why do that? Why make two separate legislative pushes within one term? It doesn't make any sense. This does not inspire confidence. She's actually opened up to even more attack, to even more distrust from the progressive base that she will need to win election. So progressives are not happy about this. And look, centrists. This is, like I said, the centrist plan, right? Elizabeth Warren is going to be attacked by centrists for this. Just you watch. She will be. And of course, the right wing. So look, this is a terrible, terrible plan. And it feels like basically giving up the fight before we've even started the fight. And we all know that when you already cede half of the fight before it begins, you've already lost. Hey guys, hopefully you enjoyed that free video. Now I'm going to have to ask you a favor. Between the demonetization and the YouTube algorithm messing around with view counts, etc., we're having a hard time adjusting to the new YouTube reality, which is where you guys come in. See, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/TYTNation, set up to help us rely on you guys, the viewers, instead of big corporate ads. Look, you know the show. You know I'm not in favor of big corporations anyway. So help us transition away from relying on the ad model to pay the bills and sign up to be a patron, patreon.com/TYTNation. That goes a long way to help us keep the lights on. And you guys will know that you're supporting independent progressive media.